Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 8th chapter in the book of Job. The book of Job consists of an exchange of monologues which collectively comprise a dialogue between Job and his three comforters, and eventually four come along, but there are three at the beginning. The first dialogue consists in heaven between Yahweh and Satan. We're not going to dwell too much on that because we got a lot to cover here, and we don't have time to do that, so we'll just break it down as concisely as possible. The Cliff Notes version: Satan successfully tempts Yahweh, who concedes to the challenge of taking away Job's wealth and his family in the first chapter, and then his health in the second chapter. And all was this to try to compel him to blaspheme against the name of Yahweh. Then in the 11th chapter, we meet the three original comforters. These are the ones who give their insight and input into Job's situation. And Job opens the dialogue after a 7-day period of prolonged silence. They're all gathered and they're just in bewilderment, shock, and unable to speak. Then Job breaks out in the 3rd chapter. He essentially wishes for death. A death wish is the most succinct summary of the 3rd chapter. Then Eliphaz assumes the dialogue initiative in the 4th and 5th chapter, and he appeals to observation, revelation, and there's a doxology in the 5th chapter, opened with an appeal to observation. Then Job responds in the 6th chapter. The 6th and 7th are his, so each, I think, one time, eventually Job, chapters 12, 13 through 14, consist of a 3-chapter speech of Job, but for the most part they're confined to a single or 2 chapters. And Job assumes, he reiterates his death wish in the 6th chapter, and then in the 7th, the lesson we most recently covered, his address turns eventually to Yahweh in heaven. He stops speaking to Eliphaz. So this is what we're going to do is in the future, as we take this series further, is just review the most recent exchange of dialogue. So in the 7th chapter, Job says many things about the fleetingness or ephemeral nature of life on earth, our mortal existence, which inform and influence some of what we read in Bildad, who assumes the dialogue. He assumes he is the speaker in the 8th chapter. So the first verse of the 7th chapter, which speaks of that, is verse 6. Job says, "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and are spent without hope." So there's 2 things he observes in life: that it is fleeting, it is gone in a flicker, and he has no hope. He is hopeless, he is helpless, he has lost all his health, all his wealth in a single day's time, in the twinkle of an eye, and suddenly and inexplicably, and he had been walking faithfully in Yahweh seems forsaken by him, and he's confused because he knows he hasn't forsaken Yahweh. Verse 7, "Remember that my life is a breath, my eye is never again to see good." So once more he comments on the fleeting, passing nature of life. It is as a vapor, we read in the book of James. And he has no hope to see good. He thinks he can only experience evil continually and inexorably at this point, because he had seen good, he had prospered materially, and his faith remained undiminished, but he has no hope of ever he wants to die. He prays for death as a sweet release from life. Verse 9, "The cloud fades and vanishes away, so that he who goes down to the grave does not come up." So mortal life is fleeting, but death is final. It is eternal, it is irrevocable, and it lasts for all time. So he seemingly subscribes to the philosophy that this life on earth is all that we have, all that we will know, but he eventually has, in the 19th chapter, he says, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." So he does offer a prelude to the resurrection to come in that chapter. "He returns no more to his house, nor does his place show him any more." So, all the things we build, all the things we have, that we can't take any of it with us to us. So we won't. Our home will be in the grave, as he sees it. Our home will be in heaven if we except if we appropriate the doctrine of the atonement to our personal account and are imputed with his righteousness. But whether we live in heaven or hell, the earthly home as we knew it and lived in it cannot be returned to once we are there. Verse 16, I have wasted away. I would not live forever. Leave me alone, for my days are a breath. So what's interesting here is he doesn't say, I am wasting away. He says, I have wasted away. That's a past tense. That means he thinks it can't get any worse. He's already wasted away. There's nothing he can add on to enhance or increase his misery, and he knows he's mindful of his mortality, and he's praying to Yahweh to just leave him alone. Don't do anything else to me. And if in fact he prays for him to kill him, because Job never seriously contemplates the course of action of suicide, but he does pray for Yahweh to just finish the job, get it over with, let him die and be alleviated from his misery on earth. He longs for the grave as a sweet release from the misery, agony, and bitterness of life, and his days are a breath. Now this the fleetingness of life is a common theme throughout both the Old Testament and New Testament. We don't have an exhaustive list, at least in our mind, but read the 90th Psalm and James. I don't even know the chapter for the vapor verse, but verse 21, and why do you not pardon my transgression and take away my wickedness? For now I lie down in the dust, and you shall seek me, but I am not. So remember, he is addressing this to Yahweh in the beginning in the 6th verse where we took off. The first 5 verses consist of his response to Bildad, and it expands and continues of much of what we read in the 6th chapter. But here he has the sense that he has sinned, and why haven't you forgiven me? Why have you because whatever sin he had committed, and sin is sneaky, there are sins of the spirit and sins of omission, but he's not aware of any sin that he's committed that could merit such devastation and ruin. And his comforters, his friends, his brothers, as he calls them in the 15th verse of the 6th chapter, insist. They come with accusations without evidence that he had, and they so what we read of Bildad reflects and repeats and reiterates much of Eliphaz's, the Temanites, archaic, simplistic theology that if you sin, suffering leads to sin, and of course that is true, but it is not always direct and immediate. And but I am not. That just means he, as he knows himself, is no more. His life is. He just he feels like he has no life or substance or sustenance in him. So he's lying down in the dust, and he's saying, if you seek me, you're not going to find me. The man I once was, the man I knew I was, is gone forever at this point as far as Job is concerned. 8th chapter, 1st verse, lesson itself, book of Job. And Bildad the Shuhithite answered and said. So what I want you to try to anticipate, because assuming it is a mystery at this point, and some of you may have read this chapter before, is how he might respond to these statements of despair and hopelessness. And one would expect that as a friend he would empathize, but Bildad is so, I'll give you the sneak preview, he is so concerned with the integrity of Yahweh's justice that he won't even empathize with his friend. He says, you must have sinned, that's why you are suffering. How long are you going to speak like this, since the words of your mouth are a strong wind? So this may be a pun on what we read of in the 19th verse of the preceding chapter, where Job says, how long do you not look away from me, nor leave me alone, till I swallow my saliva? So he opens with the same phrase, and he wants to know, how much longer can you go on like this? How much more can you speak like this? You are speaking as a fool implicitly, and because the words of your mouth are a strong wind. Now the wind, that word is also referenced by Eliphaz. An eastern wind did blow and collapse the structures in which Job's children habitually gathered to party. Nothing sinful, we can imagine. Partying is not necessarily sinful, but it was in fact collapsed by a strong wind, and wind in the ancient world would have been seen, and natural calamities of any stripe or variety would have been interpreted as a divine judgment. Does El twist right ruling, or does El Shaddai twist what is right? So this is his main concern. He wants to maintain the integrity of Yahweh's justice. Right ruling translates as judgment or justice, and what is right is, so it's only right that Job implicitly suffers as he has, because he must have sinned something terrible, else he would not be visited by such suffering and such calamity. So everything he is feeling, everything he's experiencing is completely deserved as he sees it. If your sons have sinned against him, and he delivers them into the hand of their transgression. So he's saying that the judgment, Eliphaz implies that the children of Job, of which there were I think 7 sons and 3 daughters, had died because Job had sinned in secret, and their death was a judgment on him. But now Bildad says something slightly different. He's saying that his children died because premature death, by his archaic black and white simplistic prism of theology, would have resulted in a premature death would have been a sure sign of unrepented sin, and they had sinned away their day of grace, as in his eyes. If you diligently seek El and plead with El Shaddai, so he's asking him to seek Elohim. Job has not forsaken Yahweh, yet he seems seemingly forsaken by Yahweh. So he is in the 3rd chapter, to Eliphaz's credit, he says a lot of things that are not friendly, not befitting of a friend, and much of the 3 comforters, and maybe even the 4th one, fit along that line. But he gets the wheel in motion. So Job stops wishing for death incrementally, and then starts looking for answers, because he knows that he has suffered. He doesn't know why. He knows how he had suffered all this devastation and ruin, but he doesn't know the why. The why is the big mystery, and none of these men on earth are privy to the heavenly council, of which we read the heavenly debate between Yahweh and Satan, which occurs in the first 2 chapters. If you were clear and straight, then indeed he would awake for you, and shall bless your righteous dwelling place. So the blessing would have been one of material prosperity. This is a reward for righteousness in the Old Covenant system. Now, these were not Old Covenant Jews. They were Edomites, yet they were Jews by belief. They affirmed the covenant name of Yahweh, and El Shaddai, that name appears 31 times. We already read it in the 3rd chapter. That translates as God Almighty. But he's saying that if you were indeed upright and had integrity and were blameless, then he would work on your behalf, and he would bless you with plenty and prosperity. Though your beginning was small, yet your latter end would be greatly increased. So he's imploring him to repent, to confess out loud whatever sin he has harbored in secret. They keep insisting that he must have some sin, and they want to know what it is. They're more concerned with that than empathizing and sympathizing with their friend. And he's saying, even though you had, your beginning would be small now, but you can be restored to the favor. Little does he know that he predicts something accurate. Job in the 42nd chapter is restored twofold of the possessions and the children and the livestock and the wealth that he had in the beginning of it. And, so of course his latter end does greatly increase, twofold in fact. Indeed, please ask the former generation and prepare for the research of their fathers. So Eliphaz appeals to the wisdom that was given to him in a night vision of a dream, which is one of the revelatory communications. Bildad appeals to the wisdom of the ancients, but for him it was a parking lot, whereas Yahweh wants to use the wisdom of the ancients as a launching pad, and we must cultivate the humility that Sir Isaac Newton had when he said, if I have seen further than any of my predecessors, it is only because I stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before me. So we have to, there's this postmodernism that the past is antiquated and obsolete, that our Western civilization has had it all wrong from the beginning, but there is in fact a wealth of wisdom if we just research, and research means by the very prefix to search over and over, to research. So you're not going to get the full meaning of this book by reading it once. It has to be continuously read throughout the day and throughout one's life. For we are but of yesterday, and know not, because our days on earth are as a shadow. So this is one of the verse which corresponds with the verses I selected from the previous lesson to comment on. So he's saying, we are ignorant because we are so young, and our days on earth, our life is as a shadow. That means it just comes and goes, and it instantly evaporates, and once it's gone, it's never coming back again. Do they not teach you, speak to you, and bring forth words from their heart? So he doesn't place much faith in the contemporaneous knowledge of his contemporaries. He thinks that the ancients have the more treasured wisdom and more valuable wisdom and more efficacious knowledge. So he's accusing Job of not learning from the mistakes, and he who fails to study history is destined to repeat it, to appropriate the quotation of George Santayana, and that is the collective fate of humanity. If we would only really study and learn it and implement it into government policy, we would not be in the messes that we find ourselves. Human history consists of an unending continuum of wars and wars and wars, and that's largely because we're not studying the and inequality and inequity and just everything else that's wrong with the world. And if we would seemingly learn from the past, learn from our mistakes, we would not be visited on the plagues which visit humanity and the human race indefinitely and inexorably. But realistically and tragically, human nature remains human nature. And so no matter how much we study history, we're going to be unable to change. But human nature can be changed through the born-again experience. Our hearts and minds and souls and spirits can be redeemed, and we will not walk in the ways of darkness and sin in which we once lived. Does papyrus grow without a marsh, a reed thrive without water? Papyrus is a plant that was especially prolific around Egypt, but it may have had life and a presence in the adjacent territory. Edom is not that far away, as is Israel. They are, in fact, neighboring nations, and Edom would have been to the west of it, the southwest. But papyrus grows about 10 to 15 in the air, and it is also the source of Egyptian paper. Their writings were committed to on papyrus, and that's where from our word paper derives. And he's appealing to natural phenomenon in order to address spiritual phenomena, much in the same way that when Yahweh, when he eventually intervenes and rebukes Job, and to an even greater extent his comforters who had spoken even more incorrectly about him, he appealed, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? What do you understand about the origin of the physical matter in motion? Who are you to question my moral judgment? While it is yet green, not cut down, it dries out before any plant. So this yet green means that it has just blossomed, it has just developed, it has not been cut down, and it dries out before any plant. This is just natural observation, biology. So are the paths of all who forget El, and the expectancy of a defiled one perishes. So he uses the natural phenomenon as the foundation of a metaphor for a spiritual truth, and to forget El is to have a knowledge of him, but to deliberately sideline him. It is to deliberately ignore him, and he's saying that Job has been forsaken by El because he has forsaken El. That was not the case. He maintains the conviction in his heart that that El is just, yet he wants his day in court with him to plead his innocence. And so much as the life of a papyrus, the process of birth, growth, death, and life, so too does the hope of of one who is defiled, one who is sinful, perish, and it vanishes and is no more. And Job, remember, feels hopeless and helpless. In the 6th verse of the 7th chapter, he expresses that sentiment. Whose refuge is cut off and whose trust is a spider web. So spider web, that's not something you want to trust. You don't want to stick your finger in there because you can get bit by a spider. And so he's again returning to the natural, observable phenomenon to establish the spiritual truth as the foundation for the metaphor. He leans on his house, but it does not stand. He holds it fast, but it does not last. So this is the wicked, their house is going to collapse. It literally and physically did, at least the barns or the stables where Job's children partied. I socialized, gathered. Party has an implicitly sinful connotation, but Job did offer sacrifices in the off chance that one of his children did sin without his knowledge. So this is again returning to his sons, who Bildad insists had sinned. He is moist before the sun, and his branches spread out in garden. His roots wrap around a heap and look for a place of stone. If he is destroyed from his place, it shall deny him. I have not seen you. So this is the reference of a once prosperous and healthy and vital, nutritious, and it just has all the sustenance for physical needs and spiritual needs of one who forgets Yahweh, what they were like before they forget, but their lives are going to be as fleeting and as fragile as the one. And in fact, in the New Testament, we learn that it is better to never have known the way of truth at all than to forget and forsake it. This is communicated in passages such as Hebrews 10:26, 27, and 2 Peter 2:20, 21. And if he is destroyed from his place, then it shall deny him. So not quite clear what the it is. It seems to be an impersonal force for goodness, but goodness is there's no goodness or love apart from people, so it might be more accurate to say he shall deny him in reference to El. And, that's just, I have not seen you, I do not know you, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. To leap forward to the New Testament, Matthew 7th chapter. See, this is the joy of his way, and out of the dust others grow. So the joy of his way, the way in the Old Testament, these are not technically Old Testament Jews, but that would have been the covenantal path. And out of the dust others grow. Man is formed from the dust. In fact, if you dissect our physical properties and material, an astounding percentage of our flesh and our bones have the same material properties as the dust. And we read in Genesis 2:7 that Adam was created from the dust of the earth. So as we come from the dust, so too will we return. Our physical bodies will be worm food, but if we are blessed to experience and enjoy the resurrection, we will inhabit perfected physical vessels. So the bodies we now know and have are designed and destined to decay and perish in accordance to the laws of physics, but the resurrected bodies are designed to withstand for an eternity. See, El does not cast away the perfect, neither hold the hand of evildoers. So there's a clear dichotomy. If you are flourishing and prospering in this world, that means that you are perfect or blameless in other translations, and he's not going to allow the evil to prosper for a prolonged duration of time. The evil may do some get-rich-quick scheme, but they'll have no wealth that lashes. They will perish in as much as their wealth does. So wealth is equated with life in this mathematical formula. If Job was blameless, this wouldn't have happened to him, but he is described as blameless, perfect, and upright in the opening verse of the opening chapter. 21st verse, while he fills your mouth with laughter and your lips with rejoicing, those hating you put on shame, and the tent of the wicked is no more. So one of the promises of living righteously implied or connotated in this passage, or entailed in this passage, is that we will have victory and triumph over our enemies. We do have enemies. God and Satan are at war. Their kingdoms are at war, and their followers are at war. But if we maintain the straight and narrow and endure to the end, we are guaranteed to partake in the victory which is already accomplished finally and fully and for all time and for all eternity on the cross. But, Bildad does not have does not know of the cross to come, and he is not privy to the dialogue in heaven. So this simplistic, archaic prism of theology, this black and white theology, is not at all reflective of the reality. And we have the gift of hindsight to know better than they do, and we should profit from the wisdom of the ancients. So Job is categorized as a wisdom book because there's a lot of wisdom expressed in here. There, even though there's a lot of theological inaccuracies that are not absolutely true or absolutely binding in every situation, these are principles to abide by, and we are made wiser for them. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.